Dr. Art Frankel from psychology, Dr. Raymond from the Department of Political Science, and Dr. Soheyl, Amini, the chair of the Sociology and Antler Department. And the charge we were given was to spend no more than 10 minutes talking about the relationship of blessed unrest to either the disciplines in which we teach or our own particular fields of research. My colleagues are much better spoken than I am. I find it very difficult to talk without slides, so I'm just gonna use a few slides here. Can I bring one set of lights down, please? And it actually dovetails very nicely with some things we're doing in Principles of Historic Preservation, the intro to the major. I'm an archaeologist by training, but my other great interest is in the way we live now. My issue, I think Blessed Unrest is a very fine book. My issue is that it is insufficiently terrifying in terms of its predictions and implications for how we are going to live over the next 50 years or so. We have, as most of you know, come to the point of peak oil, where half of the world's oil supplies have been fully extracted. This is not me putting on sort of a wild Einstein wig and telling you it's true, I tell you it's true. Even the oil companies admit that peak oil has been obtained. And I think to some extent we have a Jiminy Cricket idea as Americans that science will help us out in the end. If we just kind of close our eyes and go like this, then all of a sudden we'll all be driving hydrogen cars and enjoying solar power and things like that. Well, we haven't really figured that out yet, have we? In that solar panels still cost more in terms of hydrocarbons than the energy in which they put out. That biofuel costs more in terms of hydrocarbons than what we actually get out of it. I think it's a fairly terrifying situation. It's something that keeps me up at night. But the hobby horse that I'm going to beat at the moment is suburbia, which I think many of you have experienced as your lifestyle growing up. This is the usual sort of view through the dashboard. And I'm going to use my remaining 8.5 minutes to tell you that very few of you will be living this way in the future. That the project of suburbia, which I think is the most wasteful, unimaginably wasteful project that Americans have ever undertaken, is over. It's at an end. It's not sustainable. We saw this with $4 gas a couple summers ago. We'll continue to see it as it goes along. This has implications for the way in which we need to remake our landscape. We tend to build things on gigantic scale. So imagine heating a 3,000 square foot house. That's one issue. The other issue is that we tend to build them out of plastic. And plastic, of course, involves a tremendous amount of fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. The sort of Leave It to Beaver image of houses gently arranged along a cul-de-sac with cars parked out in front of them isn't going to exist, I don't think, in 50 years. I don't see how it will unless we're willing to be more like Europe and pay what Europeans pay for gas. This is how we used to build things in this country. We used to build houses in cities, small cities and big cities, on streetscapes, right? Close to one another. This is not everybody's ideal of living, is it? So it's just too close. We need that big backyard. We need the useless front yard where we never see anyone with the sort of straggly yews and shrubs and rhododendra. And we need the backyard where people are sort of deviant if they play in the backyard as well. We decided around the turn of the century that the industrial city wasn't tenable anymore, so we built streetcar suburbs from city cores out into the areas immediately at the edges of cities. Some of these were actually built as apartment houses. Some of these were built with a fair amount of quality. Some of them were built as bungalows with the idea, the dream of individual home ownership, again, on modest scales, modest backyards, and still really the integration of the outer suburb into the city itself. And we see this sort of explosion and proliferation of building styles in the 1920s and 1930s. We changed that in the post-war years with the GI Bill and the dream of individual home ownership for veterans, and we embarked on the project of suburbanization. And we don't build real houses anymore, we build cartoons of houses, plastic houses built at an unimaginable scale. I spent a long time looking at this house the other day. Every bit of trim and the siding is made out of plastic, it's made out of oil, and it scores 4 on walk score, which I'll talk about in just a moment. We used to build public places in which we took some pride. The centers of our cities had places to shop, places to experience other human beings, movie theaters, public buildings, and things like that. Places where we could stop and enjoy a pint on our way home. We had this sort of daily interaction with other human beings. We built buildings along streetscapes, along our grand thoroughfares. We had people, imagine the fact, living above commercial spaces, right? That was how most Americans experienced life prior to World War II. We built civic buildings in which we took some pride at city centers. We built city halls, we built schools, and they weren't out on the edges of the suburbs, they were directly within the city itself. Well, this is our idea of a town center today. This is the RK Newport Town Center. Note the E in town, populated by Super Stop and Shop, Walmart, Dress Barn, and a few other organizations. And yes, there is the lovely view of the Walmart parking lot. These have become our civic centers. And here we used to have people sort of stopping to chat outside of town hall. Now they're running into each other outside BJ's and sort of catching up. This is where we experience our interactions with our neighbors. If it's not in a chat room or on Facebook, it's outside of BJ's. I think there's something very wrong with this picture, and I think this is what the book is pretty good at, but as I say, not quite strong enough. If you want to experience this phenomenon in 180 degrees, go park in the Bellevue Shopping Center, as I did, and look to your right, and you see a block of commercial buildings built in the 1880s. Same idea, commercial space downstairs, residential space upstairs. Then swing your head 180 degrees at the rather vast and soulless expanse of parking in the Bellevue Gardens shopping plaza, which was inflicted on the city of Newport in the mid-1950s and won a design award as one of the best shopping malls of 1956. I have 2 kids whom I love very, very much, and I have to say the reason I'm a little bit disappointed in this book is because it's not sufficiently scary about what's going to happen. If we want to address it, there are all kinds of things that the author lays out, things we can address. But the one that I was very disappointed in, that didn't come up as much, was about the remaking of the landscape. We need to sort of think about our cities. We need to fix our cities, and by that I don't mean New York and Boston and Philadelphia. I mean of the small cities in which we live as well. We need to realize that the project of suburbia really is at an end unless we are willing to pay for it. And I don't know that we are. Some people are. There's a great essay in the Times Sunday magazine 2 weeks ago, interviews with Humvee owners who have now portrayed themselves as sort of the last of the rugged individualists and sort of declaiming their right to use fossil fuels as long as they can pay for it. That's an attitude that's going to have to change. That's what's going to be our wake-up call, because I really don't want those 2 darling children living in Little House on the Prairie times, which is sort of where it seems to be headed at the moment. Well, now that I've thoroughly discussed you, let me turn it over to Dr. Deborah. You brought in the Lakes background.
He's like Gunsler.
Hi. I'm a little nervous, and it's not because of you folks, it's because of these folks. My name is Deb Curtis. Some of you look very familiar to me. It's nice to see you. If I maintain your gaze for a while, it's only because I find your faces friendly and supportive, and I have you in class. I teach cultural anthropology here at Salve. I've been here for about 10 years. So, we were asked to give a disciplinary perspective on Blessed Unrest. So I read it through the lens of an anthropologist, through the lens of a cultural anthropologist. Within anthropology, there's a subfield called ecological anthropology or environmental anthropology. And when Dr. Garman and I were in grad school getting our PhDs in anthropology, the field was called cultural ecology. These were scholars who were interested in the relationship between the environment and people. So human ecologists or environmental anthropologists ask questions like, how do indigenous people manage their resources? So for instance, I have a dear friend who works in Papua New Guinea. And what she's fascinated by, Papua New Guinea, an island off the coast of Australia. And what she's fascinated by is the relationships between three groups. Conservationists, folks like Jim Chase who teach biology, the folks that live in the highlands, the tribal people that live in the highlands, and the gold mining companies. So we have gold mining companies, giant companies that are going into the highlands of Papua New Guinea and they're extracting gold. And while they're doing that, they're contaminating rivers. And they're changing the way in which the local people in the highlands, the most remote places that we know about, are able to live. But yet when these huge companies come in, when these, let's see, BHP Billiton. When BHP Billiton comes in as a gold mining company to extract gold, they also work in partnership with the Papua New Guinean government, giving them huge amounts of money for roads, schools, and classrooms. And I don't think there's a person in this room who wouldn't want to send their future children to a wonderful new school or have a great hospital to take your sick loved ones to. So there's a conflict at play here. You have indigenous ways of life coming in conflict with these new sort of modern amenities, schools and great public health and hospitals and doctors with clean needles. So my friend, her name is Paige West, she's an environmental anthropologist. She's interested in the intersection of these worlds. The Jim Chases of the world, the biology, conservation folks, the indigenous people that live in the highlands and have for about 40,000 years, and the mining companies, whose main goal, of course, is profit. Let me tell you about another sort of example of that's, I think, very interesting. Do you remember the movie Gorillas in the Mist? I think it came out in the 80s. Some of you might have seen it, but it stars, who does it star? Sigourney Weaver plays Diane Fossey, and many of you know that there are mountain gorillas living in Central Africa. And this actress, Sigourney Weaver, plays this woman named Diane Fossey who studies the mountain gorillas. Unfortunately, one night in the winter of 1989, her neck is slit. She's murdered by men that she's pissed off, perhaps some poachers. So when she died, her project of studying the mountain gorillas in Rwanda was taken over by a guy named Dieter Stickler at Rutgers University. So now he and his graduate students go there every year to count and keep track of the mountain gorillas. Now, I would argue that the extinction of a species is a major, environmental issue. And their numbers are drastically declining because of human living patterns, encroachment patterns, but also of poaching. And I'm sure you've all seen this on National Geographic, or you've seen it in the movies somewhere, where you have these village men coming into the mountains and killing large family members of community groups of mountain gorillas and taking the young to sell them in zoos. And everyone's up in arms about the poaching of the mountain gorilla, because it will lead to extinction eventually. But environmental anthropologists ask questions like, what about the poacher's rights? Everyone here wants to feed their family members. Everyone here wants to send their kids to good schools. I certainly do. I'll work at Burger King before I send my child to a school that's inferior. So what about the poacher's rights? What about the poacher's rights? Human rights? Animal rights. So these are the kind of questions that environmental anthropologists might entertain, in addition to the example I gave you about Papua New Guinea. But I'm not an environmental anthropologist. I'm a sex anthropologist. My work happens to be about sex. So I know very little about human ecology. I know a lot about sex. So that's why I'm going to talk to you for the remaining 5 minutes about economics. And it says right here in my notes, pause, because that's very funny. I reread that to myself 3 times last night. I'll say it again in case you missed it. I know nothing about the environment. I know nothing about the stats that Dr. Garman just quoted, but I know a lot about human sexuality. So therefore, I'm going to talk about economics. Do you get it? So what I do on Nevis, a small island in the Caribbean, very small island in the Caribbean, if it ever broke away from St. Kitts, it's a twin island federation, if it ever broke away from St. Kitts, it would be the smallest country in the Western Hemisphere. I'm really fascinated by young people your age and the sexual practices that they engage in and what they're willing to do for money and access to goods like a really new cell phone, like an iPhone, or hair extensions, or rides in imported Camrys that are air conditioned. If you've ever been to the Caribbean, you know that's a big deal. So what I want to ask is, what are those intimate moments like between girls and older men with money? What are those intimate moments like when she decides that she's going to perform fellatio in order to get access to a cell phone? But in order for me to understand those intimate moments, I have to understand economics. I have to understand something that Paul talks a lot about, and that's world debt. How many of you are motivated or motivated to listen to Bono? Well, Bono is the lead singer for U2, right? Do you guys know who he is? Does anybody listen to him? Raise your hand if you listen to Bono, U2. Wow, that's really interesting. All right, so we won't talk about Bono. Let's talk about third world debt. In your book, in the chapter entitled, did you guys read it? No, did you read it a little? In the chapter entitled, We Interrupt This Empire, he talks a lot about economics, but he just sort of throws this stuff at you. And what I want to offer you in less than a couple of minutes is just some historical context. 1944, Roosevelt calls a conference in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, and he pulls together world leaders because they have to rebuild Europe. And they have to figure out how they're going to fund that project. And they establish, out of that conference is the World Bank. You guys spell it the right way. Right? World Bank. Eventually, we have something else that's very important. It's called the IMF. In order for me to do the kind of stuff that I do in the Caribbean with sex, I have to know this stuff. Because that's going to shape somehow whether or not that girl decides to go with that guy with a cell phone. Okay? So we have the World Bank. So the World Bank was originally designed to lend money as a funding source to rebuild Europe. But eventually what happened in the 50s and the 60s is that Europe wasn't the reliable customer that they thought it would be. So the World Bank starts giving money pouring money to third world countries, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico. Eventually they start looking for other customers. How many of you have ever gotten one of those things in the mail for you to fill out a MasterCard to get your own Visa or MasterCard? You know those applications I'm talking about? They want customers, right? So that's what the World Bank wants. They want customers to lend their money to, so they start looking at third world countries. Philippines, African countries, Caribbean nations, and they're going to lend them large, large sums of money for very important development projects. Very important development projects like roads, schools, hydroelectric dams, for instance, right? So what happens is these nations start to accumulate massive, massive debts. This is very, very simplistic. Massive, massive debts. They owe so much money to the banks and the IMF, for instance, that they can't afford to, it's more than what their gross domestic product is. Enter another concept that you need to understand. I think that Paul mentions it very briefly, and then I'll wrap it up. Structural adjustment programs. These are also called austerity programs or poverty something programs. These are programs put in place by the World Bank and the IMF to help these poor countries pay their loans back. You got to get this piece. This is the third world debt. This is what your generation is going to contend with when it comes to perhaps even global unrest or global diseases. So you have a country like Nevis, very small. There's only 9,000 people on the whole island. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you anymore what the gross national product is, but they owe so much money that they can't afford to pay the World Bank back. So the World Bank's going to say, okay, I have an idea. These policymakers, these people with great degrees from Harvard and Yale and law and international banking, they come together and they say, we're going to implement these programs called structural adjustment programs. We're going to help you pay your loans back. But in order for you to pay back your loans, you got to cut your domestic spending. You got to cut your domestic spending. What's that expression when you pull your belt in? Have you ever borrowed money from somebody and they say, well, wait a minute, you got enough money to buy those boots, you got enough money to buy those cigarettes, you got enough money to buy that gas. Give me some of that money that you're spending on your boots. Anyone ever been faced with that scenario? Well, that's what some of these third world countries were being faced with. The World Bank and the IMF said, cut your spending. So what do you think they're going to cut spending on? Caitlin?
Public service projects?
Public service projects, like what?
Like hospitals, schools.
Like hospitals. Any of you ever been to a third world country where someone that you loved was very sick and you needed to get to a hospital? Anyone? And you knew that if you were in Providence, near Hasbro, you could have access to not only the best ER docs in the country, but all the medication that you needed, all the sterile needles you needed, and the clean sheets, and those lovely, lovely nurses that make you feel that the world is not going to fall apart. Right? Well, when you cut domestic spending, you can't hire those great nurses and forget the good ER doc. And you forget those great drugs to relieve fevers and fight infections, because you're not going to get any of that. And you know what else you're not going to get in countries like Nevis? You're not going to get domestic spending on preventative health care, like hiring someone who's well-trained to come into your health class to talk about safe sex. You're not going to get it. And so that's the kind of stuff that I have to know in order to understand how these young girls make their decisions. I tried to tie my research in to Paul's sort of call out, which is we need to understand the processes of the World Bank. We need to understand the processes of neoliberalism in order to really bring about social justice. So if you have any inclination to work in the area of humanitarian affairs or international relations or join the Peace Corps, this is the kind of stuff you got to get down. Thanks. I think I went over it. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Frankel. I'm the psychology department, the applied listening department, actually 6. We count half-time person, Dr. Salvatore. and I teach a variety of courses, including social psychology. I usually use PowerPoint slides as well. But when I was writing this paper last night, this morning, I didn't really have time to create a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to read you the paper. Hawkins' supposition. The world of civilization has lost much of its grace, justice, and beauty. You read the cover of the book, you know that I stole it from there. Put another way, the world is more screwed up than it's ever been. Hawkins' observation. A worldwide social movement consisting of millions of people working in 1 or 2 million or so groups is restoring the grace, justice, and beauty the world has lost because of greed, selfishness, and indifference at both the organizational and the individual level. Some Beatles lyrics perhaps sum up Hawkins' view of what's happening. I've got to admit it's getting better, a little better all the time. It can't get no worse. I have to admit it's getting better. It's getting better. So what does psychology have to say about all this? Some psychologists would be interested in describing how screwed up the world is so they could determine if in fact it's less screwed up at some later point. They would also be interested in predicting how the world might be changing as the result of this worldwide movement, or perhaps if a specific movement within the larger movement produces the kind of outcomes it claims to be after. Furthermore, some psychologists, like me, would be interested in understanding the circumstances that need to be in place to encourage people to be less greedy, selfish, and indifferent, and more justice-oriented. If we don't understand how to get people involved in smaller and larger social movements that presumably have been demonstrated to be effective in changing people in the world for the better, then the unscrewing of the screwed up world will proceed more slowly, or perhaps not at all. In other words, we'll stay screwed up a whole lot longer, increasing the likelihood that very bad things will happen. Something that Dr. Garman alluded to. An REM lyric sums up this sentiment. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. Although maybe you shouldn't once in a while. For those of you who know a little bit about REM, those last few words are my own, not REM's. In sum, psychologists might be interested in the phenomenon described by Hawkins for a few different reasons. From my personal point of view, if you want to persuade people that life can be so sweet on the sunny side of the street, yes, another lyric, which is the side that is becoming more and more crowded with all sorts of saving social movements, according to Hawkins, wouldn't it be nice to have a few ways to encourage and help people climb over, under, or around the greed, selfishness, and indifference that keeps them on the dark side and discourages them from crossing over to the sunny side? Psychologists can help with that task.
Hi, my name's Raymond. I'm in the political science department. I teach both undergraduate courses and also graduate courses in the international relations program, which basically means I teach so many different things. It all runs together. So often I don't know really when I'm teaching. So I'm going to sum up the structure of Paul Hawkins' argument from the book using these two nifty diagrams up here. There are chocolate donuts and there are jelly-filled donuts. Many people like donuts. Donuts are important. That's That's basically the structure of his argument. Hawkins, don't make me laugh. Hawkins talks about everything from taste buds to T cells to terrorism. He throws out a whole bunch of facts, but at least in my opinion, sort of the political science opinion, he doesn't do a very good job tying them all together. On page 2, he estimates, as was mentioned just a moment ago, that there are at least 1 million organizations around the planet that are working toward ecological sustainability and social justice. But he doesn't give a whole lot of evidence that these movements, whether taken separately or collectively, are actually very effective. Or if they are effective, are they more effective than national governments, international law, so on and so forth. So I'm going to show you something that Hawkins could have used to kind of improve upon his argument, make it more solid. And this is something called a Kuzmich's inverted U curve. There's the inverted U, named after an economist named Simon Kuzmich, who was a specialist in things like economic growth. So the original way this inverted U curve was drawn, if you put inequality, economic inequality on the y-axis, and per capita income on the x-axis, what this is telling you is that as a society's income increases, as people get wealthier, as their living standards improve, economic inequality, basically the division between rich and poor in that society, first it increases, but then kind of plateaus, and as income gets higher, as living standards improve even further, then that inequality is going to decrease. Okay? Now, you can change this around a little bit. Leave income on the bottom. You put pollution on the y-axis, and you can see the same thing from quite a bit of data. Basically, as a society gets wealthier, which is the same as saying as the society industrializes, it's a very dirty process. You're cranking out a lot of pollution from all these factories. But once you hit a certain income level, people begin to care a lot more about a clean environment to live in. And at that point, people begin to change their behaviors. Industry becomes cleaner, generates less pollution. Now, from here, it looks like, oh, everything's going to be fine. We've got nothing to worry about. I mean, this is kind of the cross your fingers, science will solve all of our problems argument. And again, this is based on quite a bit of data. You can see this pattern if you look at a lot of different forms of air pollution, like sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, etc. Deforestation matches this really well. So this puts a big hole in Hawkins' argument right here. But, and there's a very big but, you need to think about what's the time scale we're working with here. Okay? If you stretch this out to kind of the farthest you can go, you're really looking at about a 200-year period, because that's the period for which we have data. Okay? Most economies, most societies, they really began to ramp up their rates of industrialization beginning about 200 years ago, those that are now fully industrialized. And of course, we have many societies today that either they haven't really begun to industrialize at all yet, or they're in the initial stages, like China. So if we take a longer-term view, say we stretch it out to 100 years into the future, 200 years, we very well could see this, an N-shaped curve. But me as a political scientist, I have to ask, well, what's the basis for this argument? What kind of evidence do we have right now that we can look at and say, well, this might be happening in the future? And the best piece of evidence that I've seen is that total energy consumption, which refers to basically hydrocarbons or oil, is doing this. We might be getting more efficient at how we use oil. In other words, we can produce an overhead projector or a cable using less oil. But because more and more societies are becoming industrialized and their living standards are going up, there's a whole lot more overhead projectors and cables that are getting produced. So there's a whole lot more oil getting burned. So total energy consumption is going up, even though at least temporarily we might see a downturn in pollution. In the future, the next 100 years or so, we might see another spike. And that could be a spike that we aren't able to recover from, who knows. So if I was writing that book, as part of my argument, I would have included some discussion of something like this. Because the facts that he does present, which are a lot of them, there's enough holes in the way that he presents those facts that you can pretty much tear his argument apart. All right, so that's all I've got.
I suppose that leaves me to wipe the board, but that's okay.
I can wipe
I'll,
the board.
I'll accept that responsibility.
To be the optimist.
I have no problem with that at all. But I take one additional minute though, because anyways, I'm pleased to be here, and I'm very happy that you're here too. I represent, along with Dr. Curtis, the dynamic duo of the Sociology and Anthropology Department. But, and my name is, by the way, Soheyl Amini. Anyways, I thought a lot about this mission, challenging, very different, takes, of course, by my esteemed colleagues, psychological approach, political science, urban sort of, but it really brings to one's attention the complexity of this issue and how we really need as many tools as we possibly can that we can pick out of this tool set that we carry with. In other words, to understand it fully, we need to look at it as a psychologist, as an urban planner, as an anthropologist, as a political scientist. But here, my remaining 8 minutes, I'm going to put on the hat of a sociologist and try to look at it. I had some issues as well with the book, because my philosophy in teaching and learning is pretty much tied into critical way of looking at things, and I think that serves me pretty well. So I was looking at the title, actually, Blessed Unrest, and sort of struck me, again, I'm being a sociologist, as to do they really fit together? On one side, blessed, very high, very dear, very sacred, sacrosanct sort of definition of something that is very holy, and unrest, on the other hand, which means by definition some sort of problem, perhaps, some sort of an unresolved issue. Again, as a sociologist, we like to look at the world in many different lights and in many different views. Obviously, we start with individual, move to groups, move to communities, and finally society. And the scope of this book, in fact, pushes discussion to the global level. So as a sociologist, what can I do with this book? If someone were to tell me that you have to use this book in your sociology class, what would I do with it? Obviously, right below the Blessed Unrest is how the largest social movement, and I will stop there. So I think I have the tools to really discuss a little bit about social movements. And then, in fact, we have a course which deals, as a plug-in, we have a course which deals with social movements and social change. So I will try to analyze this movement from a sociological point of view. Try to find out how viable it is. Is it hype? I had some issues. I watched him several times. There's a 5 or 6 minute video clip of him presenting his views to a very large audience. And my take on it was that, and in which he says, this is a movement without a leader, this is a movement without an ideology. And right there, as a sociologist, I would pause and say, what are the viabilities of such a movement which does not have a known leadership? What is the viability of that movement which doesn't have any ideology to move on with the intention of accomplishing a task? See, you view a social problem, people come together, enough people of enough stature, I might say, who would declare, hey, we have a problem. Can you hear me? You know, there's pollution, there's overconsumption, and so forth. So I had some basic reservations with the movement, but I'm going to put that aside, put my sociology hat on again, look at it as a social movement, try to analyze it. Look at, again, I don't have sufficient information just to use that to make the explanation clear. What about taking a course in population studies and demography? Clearly, this book relates very directly to two basic fundamental problems that we're facing in the world right now. And they're unfortunately inversely related to one another. One has to do with resources that we have available to us, which we are consuming at a rapid rate, going down, therefore. And the other one, which is going up, is the number of people. The world population is increasing. So inherently, we're facing a dilemma. And how to solve it, though, is another issue entirely different. So the recognition of the problem, he's saying, recognize it, wake up and see that you have a problem. And all my colleagues, in fact, in their able way, pointed to the problem. That I think we are at the stage that we realize that we have a global problem. So for a global problem to be resolved, we need global solutions. And as soon as you talk about global solutions, you bring all these differing and at times conflicting interests between and amongst various nations who stand at various points of economic development. Case in point, I got the money, I can buy the gas for my hungry, leave me alone sort of an attitude. So we're also facing the challenge of dealing with those types of attitudes. Attitudes, in fact, at the global level would be perhaps a rich nation telling a poor nation that I don't care, that you know, we have a problem, but I can buy it, and in fact, that's exactly what we're doing. This cap and trade business, if you really dig into it, is that the GM is saying, let me pollute as much as I can, and I go to another country and I pay him you know, as a coupon, so we're even. Is that the way to look at this problem? So what is it that this movement is advertising? And what is it that they're trying to see changed? Again, sociology, as I said, we have multitudes of ways of looking at it. Conflict is an issue that we constantly are aware of. Social change, of course, and conflict being the engine of change, and the resolution of those conflicts in whose interest, who's benefiting from it, who's the loser, and who's the winner, and so forth. So these are not simple issues. That's why this may be a hype. That's why it may be I have no idea about it because I don't know enough about it. I know enough about sociological issues to realize that it's a very complicated matter. And it requires everybody's attention. So you go from the global realization, but the feedback is down to the individual. And that's why it brings me to the end of my brief discussion with you. In one of our previous sessions that we had together, you had to answer a question, why am I here? What does a college education mean to me? And I think that is the level where you connect to this big picture. What is it that I can do as an individual to help a little bit? To remedy at the global level, perhaps turn the lights off when I leave the room. That would be one way, by the bike, or whatever it is. So it is a continuum, but feeds back from the global to individual, recognition and realization at all levels, and cooperation. If you're more interested in these kinds of discussions, see me after the session. I have some courses for you. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for a couple of questions of any of the panelists. Oh, there's one back there, yeah.
I was just wondering, like, based on what you said about, like, suburbia and stuff like that, I was just wondering what kind of house do you live
My conscience is clean. I drive a car that does use too much gas, I have to admit, but I live within the city of Newport in a 1912 house with a really tiny backyard, but there's a playground 2 blocks away, and I actually can walk down to Broadway and do, and yeah, it's sort of, I grew up in suburbia, so I never wanted to live that way myself. I can remember being struck in the car for hours, but I guess I do live within the confines of a small town. I will say just very briefly, for a while, I lived close enough that I was able to walk to work for a while, but people thought there was something wrong with me. And in fact, I had to give up the project when one day I was walking here and one of the grounds crew pulled over and said, you know, would you like a ride? I said, no, I'm just walking, thanks. And he looked at me knowingly and said, DUI, right?